Welcome to my talk. I am Butch Mayhew, and I'm excited to share the Playwright API magic with you with this talk. May the request be with you. In this talk, we're going to jump into different ways Playwright can be used to intercept network requests, modify network requests, mock network requests, all the goodness of the network request. But before we dive in, so we're all talking the same language, let's take a look at this visual task analysis. This is visualizing a login flow of what happens on your typical modern UI that has a backend API. This is a breakdown of each different layer of a test. You can think of it that way. And in this example, this is a login flow. So we start in the UI. You might have a username and a password and a submit button. When you click that, JavaScript takes over. It says on the button, click, go do some things. And assuming that you've got all your information filled in right and the JavaScript's passed all its validations, it's more than likely going to call it make an API request. And typically, it may even use like a CSFR token or something from within the page to send to the backend server to say, hey, I know who you say you are. And that might hit a service. That service may check the CSFR token and credentials and say, are you allowed to be here or not? That will then talk to the database. If they are allowed, it will get the username and password, get the right authorization. It will build the right auth token. It will successfully authorize them and then send a response back to the API, which will then send a response back to the JavaScript and then to the UI. And typically your page is going to load, you're going to be authenticated, and maybe you land on a home page or a different page that might look different than where you were before you were logged in. And this is a typical workflow of what happens from the front end, the DOM, you can think of it, all the way to the back end through the API to the database. And really where we're going to focus in my talk today is really in between the UI and the database, right? So our UI and API and database, we're going to be manipulating and sniffing out different things with the API, utilizing Playwright and showing you some different things that can be used there. So let's jump right in. Most of this talk is going to be used. I'm going to be using actual code examples so we can walk through this together. So the first one is going to be an example of intercepting an API request for assertions. So this is going to use some different Playwright methods, the route method, the fetch method on the route, and then route continue. And the idea of this is we are going to make an API call, and this API call is going to have information. It's going to be returned to the UI, and we're going to sniff out that API call. We're going to capture all the data, and we're going to use that data in our UI test for our assertions. So before we get started too far, let's hop into the test we're going to be testing against. This is practicesoftwaretesting.com. It's a tool shop demo. And when I refresh the page, I've got my network tab open so you can see the different API calls that are made. The specific one that we're going to intercept on this one is this products API call. So this full call is api.practicesoftwaretesting.com/products. And we are just sending this payload, and the response comes back as a bunch of information with data, with IDs, and then within each of these IDs, there's brand information, category information, there's images, descriptions, there's prices. So for example, this picture here, combination pliers, is this value right here. There's the price. So all this stuff we actually have access to. So let's jump into a test and actually look and see what it's doing. This is a repo that is public. So if you want to go check it out, it's playwright-practicesoftwaretesting.com. It's within my Playwright Solutions repo that will be linked, or we'll be sure to include a link there. All right, so I'm going to scroll down to this first test here. This is, we want to validate product data is visible in the UI from the API. So what's going to happen is, similar to what we said, we are going to make a call. We're going to go to the home page. And, this is just some syntax. I'm just going to walk through it so you can kind of understand what's happening, and maybe we'll even like pause it and debug it as it goes along. So this is the syntax for a test. So test, within that, we're creating a variable called products. And then I've actually created a test step here. And within that test step, we're doing a await page.route. And this is the magic of this is we're going to create a route for this API. And I've got 2 stars over here. So anything with /products that'll come through this URL will get routed through this route. And within this route, we are going to create a variable called response. We're going to await the route fetch. So we're going to wait like this response to come back and set it to a variable called response. And then I'm going to take this products that I set up here down here, and I'm going to set that variable equal to the response.json. Okay. And then we're going to say, once you've done that, I need you to take the route and continue moving forward. So really just running this code, nothing's actually going to happen when I run the test because this page route is kind of set up, but it's not going to intercept anything until we actually use the goto method. So this await page.goto is going to load the page. We're going to wait for the load state for the network to calm down. Then we're going to set a locator called the product grid. So in our example, that's actually going to be this whole grid of 9 different items is going to be that object. Or that's going to be the locator. And then we're going to say for each of the products we have, for each data, so we're going to do a for each loop. We want to get the name and the price, and we're going to validate that the product grid contains the product name and the product price in our test. So let me go ahead and I'm going to debug our test here. So that is going to get things started for us. It should open up a browser as it's loading. So we're actually on the products data. So one real cool thing with the Playwright debugger is I can actually see all the different elements I've created. So this products value here, I actually have all that information here. So I can see within the data, there's all the different IDs that have been intercepted with all the details. And what's going to happen in this next section, right? The UI is over here. It's done loading. It's basically going to go through and say, for each product grid, I want to expect it to have this stuff. So let's go ahead and run this. So it ran it. It checked it. Everything passed. So everything is happy. And that is one easy way to intercept network traffic and actually validate. This actually did 9 different assertions because it went through each of those values to validate the product name and the product price was there, right? Of course, I could go in and do that with the screenshot, or I could do lots of other things with that, right? The sky's the limit. I found this is a really, really useful way to quickly, do a lot of assertions on a page from data from the API request. So I don't have to go create specific data in this scenario. I can just go make sure the UI is displaying the data properly. The next section here is, sometimes we run into scenarios where we might have a call that is long and we might want to abort it. So we're going to walk through that. So page.route and then route.abort. So in this specific scenario, if we go look at our code, we're going to say we're going to abort the category tree call. And this is what that looks like. We're going to set a page route. We're going to go to it. And then we're going to expect basically that this sort AZ, name AZ, to not contain power tools. Okay. So, and that's because this category actually has the power tools in it. So we're going to just go check that. I'm going to set up my Playwright thing to show the browser so we can actually see this in action and see what's happening. So specifically the categories, if you can see over here, is actually not loading. So it's not loading because we blocked out that request. That categories has all those calls in there. If I go back to our test site, you can actually see this is typically what's returned by the categories. You can see this is all the data that comes in and that actually gets displayed here. And in our test, we're not doing that. So I found that this is really useful for a test, or if you have got a really long running API call that you're like, I don't need to have this, or maybe it's images that you don't need loaded. You can just abort those network requests and not worry about them, because that's not what your test is caring about in that scenario. And it can be really useful. In this next section, we'll talk about modifying an API request within a Playwright test. This is going to use page.route and then route.fetch and route.fulfill. So let's zoom in on over to our code. This is the test. We're going to validate product data is visible from the modified API. So we're going to intercept the products. We're going to route that, and we're going to set the response to route.fetch. And then we're going to take that response and get the JSON from it. We're going to set that to a variable called JSON. And then we're going to update the JSON.data, the first value in the array name. We're going to set that to mock product. We're going to set the data price to 10,001 and the in stock to false. And then down here, we're going to fulfill the route once the request comes in. So let's look down here. We've got our goto, our wait for load state, and then we're going to expect that the product grid link, the first one, so we're being very specific here, contains the text, mock product, out of stock, and the price. So let's go ahead and run this test and see the API overrides in action. So the call was made. We've got our mock product is out of stock, and it's 10,000. So because we are mocking this, because we're faking it, typically interacting with this element after we've mocked it is not going to work. So that's just one caveat that you need to think of if you choose to adopt this strategy. What's really nice about it, though, is you don't have to have any specific test data created before you begin your testing, which is one of the hardest problems when it comes to test automation. This lets you shortcut that and really just test, hey, if the API responds with this value, does the UI look correct or not? The next thing we want to walk through is mocking API requests from JSON files in a Playwright test. So we're going to use Playwright route and then route fulfill JSON and then pass in the JSON object for this. So let's go take a look here. And this is actually the code that allowed me to quickly generate a JSON file. So if I were to uncomment this, I can see that all I'm doing is I'm routing our categories tree. I get the response. I set it to a JSON file, and then I'm just writing that JSON file to JSON categories.json. So it would be over here. So I basically wrote this, but what I did is I took the original file and actually modified it, and I added, instead of hand tools, I added some test tools. So let's go just run this and actually see what it looks like. So we're going to comment this back out because we don't want that. So down here, I'm setting the const. This is a variable, test tools. I'm going to JSON parse the JSON category file that we just looked at. And then when it comes to routing and fulfilling this route, we're going to pass in the JSON object. So all the JSON is getting passed. So we're going to go to the file, wait for network, and then we're going to validate that our section for different names contains Playwright. So let's run this test. And if I look on the left-hand side, you can actually see test tools. So these are the categories I passed in. Again, this allows you to quickly validate that, hey, things are loading correctly on the page, as expected. all within a Playwright test, which is pretty nice. All right. Hope you found this helpful. Just some final thoughts. If you're interested in learning more about Playwright, you can check out my blog, playwrightsolutions.com. I try to post there once a week. There's a lot of information out there. Feel free to subscribe today, and thank you for your time.